Aunt Eugenia Pulliat, you know, in the family. When she died, it was in 1918 when Aunt Campbell was here and Aunt Adele for her funeral. See, that was their sister. My mother, she made a big, big meal and had them over, you know, to entertain them. And then when they went home after that, they took Grandpa home with them to Seattle, and he spent about a year with them. And then when he came home, he was home just a few days when he dropped dead. But I can remember the folks were going to go out to visit him on the following Sunday. They had to bribe one of my cousins because they didn't have a car. They bribed him to take him out in his car, Joe Coulomb, my cousin. And they'd give him a couple bucks for gas, and then he'd take him out. But you see, it never came about because Grandpa died before.
Didn't you talk about going out there on the train to the funeral?
It was the anniversary, the year 1920, when they usually had an anniversary mass the following year. But now for the wake, Grandpa Hamel's wake, they got Joe Coulomb to drive him out, and I went with my father and whoever. I can't remember my mother going. She went for the funeral, which was a few days later, but I didn't go. See, this was the same night when they were displaying him the first time, and I got to go with my father then. I don't remember which there was other kids with us, but I don't remember. But we went with Joe Coulomb that night. That was in 1919. Grandpa Hamel died in October 1919. We just loved him. He used to come often to visit us here in Minneapolis. And you see, he was retired. He didn't have the farm anymore, and he lived with Uncle Bert, and he helped him, but he had given the farm to him then because he didn't have anybody at home. And of course, Uncle Bert, my father's brother, had made the home for the children that were still at home when Grandma Hamel died. See, that was customary, that somebody had to make a home for the little ones. And usually they took probably the oldest son at home. But anyway, when Grandpa Hamel died, he had spent about, maybe a year in Seattle with his sister, Aunt Campbell. When we lived at 1326 5th Street, the house was always full. Our aunties, Pa's sisters, or his brothers, they were all, they'd come and visit. They'd spend the night, and there was always a lot of happiness in the home.
Did the grandparents ever come over there too?
Oh yes, they were there. Grandma came every day.
How about your grandfather?
Well, you see, he died. He was sick, you see, when we first moved there. And he had to, if we wanted to see him, we had to go to him. He came there just a couple of times, but he had ailed for quite a while.
You don't remember him very much then?
Well, not that much. Another thing, too, that was so much happiness there was a vacant lot next door. So I don't know if they got permission or what, but anyway, we got to flood that lot. And we had a skating pond there. Because when we moved in at 1326, in the basement or the cellar, the former renter had left all kinds of stuff, and there was a bunch of skates. A pair like your Joan bought there, the clamp skates, there was lots of them there. Although Archie and Lil had bought their own before when they were first started to work. But the rest of us kids used the clamp skates, and we got to skate. That's where we learned to skate on this pond. That was part of the happiness there.
Do you remember anything about school then, or?
Yes, during 1918, during that winter, 1718, they closed the schools because of the Spanish influenza. They were dying like flies. People were dying like flies. So they had the schools closed down for a couple months that year.
Nobody in your family got it?
No, they were sick, but I don't know whether it was or not. But I know there's several of the neighbors that got it. A lot of them took sick in the morning. By evening, they were dead.
remember telling the story about the little boy that drowned in the quarry?
Yeah. I was younger then. We were living at 304 12th Avenue Northeast. One day when we were in school, there was a big commotion there around lunchtime. Of course, I was younger then, about 9, I guess. We went over to see what it was. It was near school. It was on the lunch hour. And when we got over there, it was a big quarry. They used to quarry limestone a lot northeast. It was at the present site of All Saints School over northeast on 5th Street and about 5th Avenue. The police were there, and they were fishing for a little boy that had fallen into the water. You see, these quarries were left. It was a deep hole, and then the water would collect at the bottom, and this little boy, about 3 years old, had fallen in and drowned. And I can remember that I think I could still visualize that little body coming up on that big hook that the police had to fish him out with. All the water was dripping off, and that little limp body on the end of that hook. And that haunted me forever afterwards. It was just terrible. Another thing, too, that happened that same year, gypsies used to come to town. That was another thing. There was rumors that there was a big 6-flat, I guess, or an apartment house, I guess, or a big flat that right on 6th Avenue, right near the school. And somebody got the word around that the gypsies had moved in there, and we were scared to death. Of course, gypsies meant kidnapping and fortune-telling and all the bad things you can think about. Everybody was afraid of the gypsies, so we didn't go out very much there.
Did you graduate from grade school?
And when I got to the 5th grade, I decided to go to the summer school. I was old. When I got back to the French school, they didn't know what to do with me then. You see, I had part of the 6th grade under my belt, and they didn't know what to do with me. So the sisters went in a conference, and they decided, well, maybe I could keep up if they put me in the 7th grade, which they did. See, I skipped the whole 6th grade, but they didn't take into consideration there was a lot of that stuff I should have learned. Well, I got along fine in the 7th grade, but when I hit the 8th grade, it was disaster. I didn't want to go to school. And then again, another thing, too, that was against me was I was going into adolescence. And that was a very traumatic episode in my life, because leaving childhood, going into adolescence. And I remember telling my mother I was sick every day when I didn't want to go to school. And the more I stayed home, the less I could keep up. And it finally ended up in the 8th grade that in order to get a certificate, I had to go to summer school. And then they gave me a certificate. And then I went to high school, and that was worse. I went to Edison. And then to go from a sister school into the public school. And the public school had different names for the same identical thing. I wasn't familiar with it. And then I decided, no, this is not for me. So I told my mother I was sick. So I didn't have to go then. You know, I was cagey, too. The truant officer over at Edison came to visit my mother, and I guess, you know, it was compulsory school, so they decided that they were going to give me a physical, see if I really was sick. I wasn't. So, well, finally they announced to my mother that they couldn't find anything wrong except that I was tired. Maybe I didn't go to bed early enough. But they didn't know what was going on in my head. You're a little frantic about leaving childhood and then getting in a strange situation. I didn't know anybody. I was very shy. I didn't have any the friends that I had made in school. I had left them behind when I skipped that grade, and then I didn't fit in with the new kids because I was too shy. Well, anyway, it was a disaster. Well, long after they got through giving me the physical and deciding I wasn't sick, the head one there, the truant officer, I don't know, what did they call him, a counselor? I guess they call him a counselor now. She told me, she says, well, I was already 15 years old, and I was going to be 16 the following spring. She says, well, she says, at least you can come back when you're 16. If you still don't want to go to school, she says, you can quit then. So, well, I gave in and I went back. And in the meantime, I didn't plan on learning to like it. By the time I was 16, I was in love with it. And by that time, I decided that I was going to go on to college. So in those days, each course was they were divided. If you were going to be a secretary or office work, you took a commercial course. And if you wanted to go to college, it was academic. And if you wanted to be a trade, well, then that was industrial. Well, I was taking the commercial course, and then I decided, well, I'm going to be a teacher. And I changed over, and I just loved the work. You know, the science and the math. I was a whiz at math. I went on until I was going to graduate the next year, and I went to work that summer. I remember it was the summer of 1925. I had started summer school to kind of get more out of it. And they needed a girl for some factory work where Doris was working, and I went to work. And I made good money there. And then by the time school started again, I decided, well, I'll keep working. And my mother says, oh, you'll never use that. Go to college. She says, that's just a waste. You'll get married and you'll never use that. Well, I didn't get any encouragement there in any way. I didn't go back to school. Well, by the first of the year, the darn shop closed. They moved to Sylvania, Ohio. We were making light bulbs for cars. And they just pulled out of Minneapolis completely. There I was, no job, no school, nothing, and too proud to go back to school. And I spent a lifetime regretting it. And maybe that's why you kids, I think I'd have killed you if you'd have pulled that stunt on me. I know I would have, to quit school. And maybe that's what made me so more determined than ever.
Yep.
In 1923, he got married. That was the first breakup of the family then. He married Alice. Then the following year, Lil got married in 1924. He got married on October 30th, 1923. Lil got married the following year on August 19th, 1924. And Doris got married, I guess it was July 6th, 1925. Then after the first of the year, I guess along in February, I was looking for work, and I got in at the telephone company. Then I worked there as a telephone operator. Number please. Until I got married then in 1928. I met Dad around Easter time in 1927.
Why don't you go into more detail now? I know you used to talk about them and Pep chasing away some of the suitors and so on. There's more. It's interesting.
Lil and Archie had a hell of a time getting away. Because every time Lil had found a real nice fella, they'd break him up. I'll never forget when one of the first ones, Archie had a girl. He brought her home to one of these parties over at 1326 5th Street to meet the relatives. He was engaged to her, and her name was Alice Hausen, where the one he married was Alice Hansen. Well, anyway, with Alice Hausen, she was crazy about it, but my mother decided, and the relatives decided, she couldn't possibly have been a good girl because she was in Minneapolis alone. Now, I don't remember if she was rooming and boarding with someone or if she had an apartment by herself. Her home was out of town. There was no other way of working in Minneapolis. They didn't reason that. Now this was in, I think, 1919. There's two sheet musics in there that one day she had mailed it to him. And of course, everybody was against Alice. You know, she was no good. And when, I don't remember if Archie got, my mother opened all the mail, by the way, and I don't remember, she opened it first before he got to it anyway and found this music. And one of the sheet music was Love Hears My Heart and I Love You Truly. They're both beautiful songs. You hear them on the radio or television today. They're standard. Well, anyway, we with my pea brain, I was going to do something to Alice, so I took and tore it. And the tears are still in there. Well, we weren't supposed to like her. Our mother didn't like her, so we weren't supposed to like her. You know, we were kids. Well, anyway, that got broke up. And then Archie had he didn't have many girls. He had another one. She was a Swedish girl, Hazel Oman. He went with her a while. He had met her at Donaldson, but nothing came of it. You know, in those days, religion played a big part in it. So he didn't really have anybody.
Why don't you go into more detail now? I know you used to talk about them and Pep chasing away some of the suitors and so on. You know, there's more, it's interesting.
Lil and Archie had a hell of a time getting away. Because every time Lil found a real nice fella, they'd break him up. I'll never forget when one of the first ones, Archie had a girl. He brought her home to one of these parties over at 1326 5th Street to meet the relatives. He was engaged to her. And her name was Alice Hausen, where the one he married was Alice Hansen. Well, anyway, with Alice Hausen, she was crazy about it. But my mother decided, and the relatives decided, she couldn't possibly have been a good girl because she was in Minneapolis alone. Now, I don't remember if she was rooming and boarding with someone or if she had an apartment by herself. Her home was out of town. There was no other way of working in Minneapolis. They didn't reason that. Now, this was in, I think, 1919. There's two sheet musics in there that one day she had mailed it to him. And of course, everybody was against Alice. You know, she was no good. And when, I don't remember if Archie got, my mother opened all the mail, by the way, and I don't remember, she opened it first before he got to it anyway and found this music. And one of the sheet music was Love Hears My Heart and I Love You Truly. They're both beautiful songs. You hear them on the radio or television today. They're standard. Well, anyway, we with my pea brain, I was going to do something to Alice, so I took and tore it. And the tears are still in there. Well, we weren't supposed to like her. Our mother didn't like her, so we weren't supposed to like her. You know, we were kids. Well, anyway, that got broke up. And then Archie had he didn't have many girls. He had another one. She was a Swedish girl, Hazel Oman. He went with her a while. He had met her at Donaldson, but nothing came of it. You know, in those days, religion played a big part in it. So he didn't really have anybody. You see, when we moved from 1326, we were ordered out of there because there was an extreme housing shortage. Just extreme. The owner's son, he was ordered out of his place. You know, a lot of houses were sold, and then the tenant had to get out. Well, that happened where the owner's son had to get out of his house. So the only place he could go was where we were living. So that's when the family pooled all their resource. And Pa had, he was a great one for stashing 50 cents here, $1 there, and so forth. And he had stashed away $2 million. But between the whole family, they managed to scrape up $500. And that's when they paid down on 445.
What year was that about?
1920. Mrs. Schuster. When we got over there, that first year it was nothing but sickness. Everybody was sick. I guess I was the only one that didn't get sick. Pa got about with, the doctor says it was some kidney disease, Bright disease, but I don't know if he knew what Bright's disease was. But anyway, he was always sick. Archie was deathly sick, almost died. Lil ended up in the hospital. Charlie was in an accident. He was sick. The whole outfit, it was just a disaster. And there Sam Eamon was still charging grocery. They got by. You know, in those days there was no such thing as welfare. You pulled yourself up by the bootstraps. Before Lil, when we first got over to, no, I think it started when we were still at 1326. She started to go with the nicest young man. He was Catholic, everything you would want with him. And they became engaged, but he was jealous. And my mother held that against him. Anyway, when we were over at 445, she finally broke him up. But, oh, that was a disaster. Because they both cried. And then that came back through the grapevine that Leonard's, and his name was Leonard Gates. His mother and father were going to help them get married. And somebody was going to have a shower on her, and they made the mistake of inviting Joe Coulombe's wife to the shower. Well, then it got right back to Aunt Lonnie and right to my mother. They were getting married anyway. Well, then all hell broke loose. She finally broke them up. That was just before Lil ended up in the hospital with the big operation. It eventually, they both married someone else. And then this Leonard, in later years, before my mother died, probably was sometime in the 30s, he became a salesman for gift wares, gifts, vases, and all that. And one time he stopped to visit my mother, and my mother regretted that she did that to him. Because he was a nice fellow. He was much nicer than Roy. Well, they didn't want to lose me either. And I think having had that experience, watching Lil get heartbroken, I think that was one of the reasons why I was so determined that nobody was going to do that. I get pretty stubborn. Because what was wrong with him? Dad had two things going for him. When any of us brought a new friend home, one of the first questions she'd ask, is he French? Is he Catholic? And does his parents own their own home? Dad had only one thing going for him. His parents owned their home. And then, of course, the Swedish people weren't popular. There was a big influx of Swedish immigrants at the time. They couldn't talk English, so nobody could talk. They couldn't communicate with them, and they thought they were too clannish, so evidently they were no good. And, well, anyway, I kept going with him anyway, and we finally got married. But then afterwards they accepted him, and they thought he was a wonderful person. Well, when I met Dad, Roy's sister was married to a politician.
Better give names.
His Jesslyn Scott. I.G. Scott was a politician. He was, at the time, he was an alderman. And he was raising money. They were having a benefit dance. They always had benefits, where you paid and then they used the money to further their campaigns and so forth. And this happened to be one of them. And I went with Lil and Roy, and of course Roy's sister Adeline, she's Adeline Whitney now, and of course Jesslyn Scott was there, and then two of our other girlfriends, Corinne Garland was one of them, and then Ann Scarry. The four of us, we were chumming around together. We worked at the telephone company together. Anyway, we went to this dance. It was on West Broadway and about 3rd Street. And of course, Dad was with a bunch of his friends, the son of another politician that was running for the legislature. His name was Youngdahl. Earl was the son, but they were all, I guess, pseudo-communists. They belonged to what they call the Farmer Labor Party. They were socialists, all socialists. You know, they always gave them a fancy name. Dad was with this group of boys that got the young people together. And of course, I thought Dad was just the crummiest guy. Well, I thought, in the first place, he looked so sweet that we weren't, you know, we were looking down on. He was so blonde and those big blue eyes, and his skin was snow white, you know. And I thought, well, you know, you always thought of somebody tall, dark, and handsome. Although he was very good looking. The boys, there was 4 of the boys asked to take the girls home. Well, Roy and Lil, you know, that was my sister, you know, so they weren't going to let the boys take us home alone. So they provided the car. We all got in their car. They had a great big Oldsmobile. So we could all get in there. See, the 4 of us. It was, yeah. So the boys, I guess they did, you know, ride. They didn't protest. So they took us, and the girls all slept with me that night. So, and then he took the boys home. Well, Ole Carlson was the one that kept it going. He took the phone number. I don't remember if he took my phone number. I think it must have been mine. And then we got the gang together again. And the only thing, Dad was supposed to be with Corinne Garland. That's the one he took home. But I guess, you know, he was a stinker. You know, if he didn't like a girl, that was it. And I guess Corinne didn't quite suit him, so he brought his own girl. That was Mildred Engstrom. Well, anyway, we went out. I guess Ole had his father's car that time. So we went out. I don't remember what the guys that was supposed to be with me. Nothing happened anyway. And then, it was a short time later, well, Ole and his brother and Dad, they had the 3 boys, and we were going to go over to Lillenroy somehow or other. Anyway, the fellow that I thought was going to be with me, he didn't show up. I guess I didn't register with him. Anyway, then when we were at Lil's, then Dad took a second look at me. I guess from then on, we were paired up. And then the guy that with Adeline, Ole was, he wasn't too much of a girl. You know, he liked to talk a lot. He wasn't too much for the girls. Anyway, nothing happened there. Anyway, Adeline got another fella from over northeast. And they eventually married, but he was a drunk, and they later divorced. With Dad and I, it went on, and of course that first summer of 1927, all we could, either one of us could hear is, we're never going to get married. We want to see more of the world, and you know, all that baloney.
Is that what you said to each other?
Oh yeah. You know, you just didn't register. And then by fall, well, it was a little bit better.
What'd you do, go to shows, or what would you do?
Yeah, we'd go to the show, or else he'd pick me up. We didn't get to go very much because I had to work evenings at the telephone company. He'd come and pick me up at the telephone company. And then on Sunday, when I didn't have to work, a lot of times we'd come over to his folks.
What did Grandma think about her French girl, her Grandpa?
Grandpa didn't like it. I didn't know that until afterwards. And Lena, it was just horrid. I was about the worst one he could have picked out. But Grandma and I got along fine. I don't know. It seemed I fit in, you know, the 2 of us became friends. But then after it was a stormy time to get married because my folks fought it tooth and nail the whole time. Then finally they gave in. And of course Dad wasn't too friendly. He was very shy, and he hated Lil because she was going to take charge of his wedding, and he wanted to go off and get married without, eloping. I couldn't see that. All you do is hurt your people around you. Well, anyway, when we finally did get married, of course we had to get married in the priest's house because that's what they did in those days. And of course I had a veil and a white dress, and I don't know why nobody saw us at the church, Afterwards, when we come home for the party, well, then people saw us after that. But it was those days. It wasn't very good for mixed marriage. Well, the only ones that were in the rectory with us was Clary and Leona. They were the witnesses, and the priest. That's the four of us. We went there at the rectory at Our Lady of Lourdes, but that's the way they did it in those days. It wasn't until World War II that they opened up and let people get married the way they should.
So where were you working then when you got married?
I had to quit my job because they would not keep a married woman. So there we were.
And where was Dad working?
He was working at Eklund Bus Body, making bus bodies. He was in the tool room there. Did make very little wages. I don't know how in the world we ever...
What was he making?
$18 a week. But of course he put in a lot of overtime, so it made more. But then I got a job. The first month we didn't... we lived over right across from Billy's. It was 2131 Irving. We lived there for a month, and then we went over to northeast to my folks' house. They had, my father remodeled part of their upstairs, made a 2-room apartment. Dad hated it. Clarence and Charlie were still home then. There was 4 great big bedrooms up there, and then another bedroom downstairs for my folks. But Dad, he wanted to be on his own. Well, we stayed there over winter. I got a job at Honeywell then through the winter. Most of that factory work was seasonal. Then when I got laid off and the work ran out, well, then the next job I went in sewing. The following, I guess after Christmas, I got a job. Then the season started in the garment shops. So I'd worked out the seasons there. Well, then in the following summer, about in May, well, then we decided to get a place by ourselves, buy furniture, which we did. And we moved up there on Irving there at 2226, I guess it was. Irving North. It's near Billy's. And we were there about a year and a half.
Is that where it was so doggone cold in the winter time?
Yeah, it was cold there. Sure, it was cold because we had a heating stove, a hard coal heater, and Dad always had to sleep with the windows open, and the windows stayed open all day from the bedroom, and we had a big doorway, and all we had that was separating, we hung a blanket over there. Well, naturally it was cold. Of course we're dumb, we didn't figure that out. But then then late that fall, the fall of 1930, then there was a place over northeast that became for rent. Well, when my mother hadn't seen it, but she drew the woman down. Of course, at that time, the rental property was a glut on the market. If they got a vacancy in the fall, they could plan on all winter being vacant. Sometimes it would be vacant a whole year. She called this woman and convinced her she should take us and that we should pay $25. I guess she wanted $35. Well, anyway, the woman says she would let it go over winter, but then the following summer she would have to raise it to the price that it would be. Well, we moved in there and it was so beautiful in there. It was a great, big, beautiful home. That was at something like 1222. That was on 6th Street Northeast. The owner was a cement contractor, a bricklayer contractor, and so they had a beautiful home there. Everything was so nice. I was almost ashamed to move in there for $25 a week. And it had furnace heat. So we were, that was our first. And then that lasted until Dad was still working. And, of course, our depression was moving in on us, slow but sure. You see, in 1929 was the stock market crash. Well, it hit New York first, and then it moved here. Through the 1930s, it was still limping. Minnesota it wasn't as bad here as it was in other parts of the country. But see, Dad still held his job. And, of course, I was following the seasons with the sewing. When my job had run out and get laid off when the work ran out, there was always somebody that was busy. So I'd go get a travel that way. That went on until on New Year's Eve between 1931 and 1932, Dad got the axe. That's it. That was the days long before the unions. The unions were born in the Depression, Anyway, we paid our rent the month of January and gave her notice. She felt bad when we had to move, but they couldn't give it to us. There was no prospects, nothing. And of course, at that time, I didn't have work either. Because, you see, in the dead of winter, usually you didn't work in the garment industry. Well, anyway, I went home and I was crying to my mother. She says, "Oh, don't cry, Pearl." She says, "The apartment is up there yet." She says, "You just come." So that's what we did. On the 1st of February, then we moved out, and I guess I cried the whole time leaving that beautiful house there. But we went back, and we put our furniture in storage. The old grandpa, Soderlund, loaned us $100 to pay off the furniture. And then Lena, I don't remember, Lena loaned us some, I think it was something about $40. You see that, you might have been in 40 million as far as that goes, because it was worth that much more. She loaned us a little bit. And Grandma and Algot fought over it because he thought Algot could have helped us. He could have helped us many times over. I think there was a rivalry among them because they were both talented in the same way. And I know Grandma got after Algot to help us, and he wouldn't do it. Mel he's such a smart aleck, and of course he didn't like me. But anyway, we got by. We went back to my mother's. We stayed there for a couple of years, about 2.5 years.
Did either one of you work during that time?
I did. It was easier for a woman to get a job. No, I worked just about the whole time. But Dad started in with his drawing in 1932 then, see. When my grandmother died, Grandma LaFave died, in 1926, you see, they had their Social Security, which was 1309 5th Street Northeast, and 1315, 2 duplexes. That gave them enough income to get along with. Of course, they couldn't travel. They couldn't live high, but everything was paid for, and that gave them enough money to, like Social Security today. That's how they provided for their old age. So they were well off. So when my grandmother died in 1926, that left the estate, their estate, which was to be divided between my mother and her 2 sisters and her brother. Well, at the time, there was no sale for real estate whatsoever. It was garbage as far as anybody was concerned. But Mrs. Schuster, who the folks bought their home from, she, somehow or other, she got to be real good friends with my mother and could realize, and she controlled my mother so much as far as business, and she told her what to do, my mother didn't. And at the time, then by 1929, my mother was talking to her about this estate. By 1929, she had told her that she would finance her to buy out the brother and 2 sisters.
Who was minding the buildings all this time?
Aunt Dora. She was tired of it. This is my mother's sister, Aunt Dora. Mm-hmm. Although she took the rent she got out of it and divided that between the family. So my mother had a little money, which she didn't throw in she never threw hers in the kitty. The rest of the family did. In 1932, then my mother negotiated with Mrs. Schuster to buy out her 2 sisters and her brother. And then that meant that they got the property there on 5th Street, 1309 and 1315. But then she had to pay her back. But she had rents then to pay her back. Hit home here. My father worked the whole time. He worked every day. And then they had the rents besides. So my mother got after Mrs. Schuster then to buy 1510 5th Street, which Charlie had bought years before. And it wasn't for him. He didn't take an interest in it all. Anyway, he was glad to get out of it. And all she paid for it then was the price of the lot, I guess $500. But it was a shambles. It was fit to be torn down. It was that bad off. Well, anyway, with the money she had stashed away, she had done some babysitting for my sister Doris. You know, she took care of Pearl, so she could go out and work. Well, she put all that money in her kitty. Well, she had enough there to remodel 1510 and make it rentable. It stood vacant an awful long time. For a while there, just the upstairs was vacant, and then finally when I guess what made Charlie was so depressed is he lost the people downstairs. And then it was vacant completely, just going to hell. My mother stuck her neck out, and then they remodeled it. And that's where Dad and Archie came. Archie wasn't working, and he'd come over. Well, then she didn't give them money. Archie'd go home with his arms full of groceries. She fed them, or rather, they fed them. But they did the work. Clarence helped, too. Of course, he wasn't married yet. You know, they made it rentable. So by 1934, then, in the summer of 1934, Dad and I were doing well enough that I guess he had gotten in with Fawcett Publication, and then he was selling to the magazine, freelancing, and with my work we were doing well enough that we decided to take our furniture out, and we moved in 1510. She had lost her tenant then, and all we paid was $20 a month. Clarence had gotten married in 1933, and then they set up housekeeping above in the upstairs, so that took care of both. But then everything went pretty good through 1934 and 35. And then towards the end of 1935, we were spending all our money running around, having a good time. I told Dad that's not for me because we were spending everything we earned. That winter we decided that was it. We were going to change friends. It was too much partying. When we did that, boy, you should have seen the way the money piled up. I got a fur coat that fall. I got a mango. I got all kinds. By February, we had the vast sum of $250 in the bank, which was enormous. And then before that, when we'd go out riding on Sunday afternoon with Doris and George, the Rooneys, for amusement, we'd look at houses for rent. And then, of course, they finally just disappeared. Then we decided, well, we got to still have recreation, so we decided to look at houses for sale. And one Sunday when we were looking at houses for sale, we found this one, our home. The next thing you knew, we were negotiating, which we bought. It was a foreclosure. And then by the time the deal was closed, I guess it was too much for my mother to lose me completely because we lived next door when we lived northeast, and she thought she was going to lose me forever. She had a bad heart. I don't know to what extent it was an act or if it was really that she was actually sick. Anyway, the doctor had prepared her for death. He had us give her the last sacraments and everything. Well, then by that time, I didn't have the heart to move away, and then we were scared too because the payments were going to be so high, $22 a month plus the taxes, and we didn't know whether we could swing that. So we rented it then for 4 years. In the meantime, our sweet little bill came.
What was Lena paying here for rent?
$35.
So she was covering the taxes.
She was covering it.
Did you have any profit at all in it? Was that
No.
That was about it?
No. But at least we weren't out money. Clarence had gotten married in 1933, and then they set up housekeeping above in the upstairs, so that took care of both. But then everything went pretty good through 1934 and 35. And then towards the end of 1935, we were spending all our money running around, having a good time. I told Dad that's not for me because we were spending everything we earned. That winter we decided that was it. We were going to change friends. It was too much partying. When we did that, boy, you should have seen the way the money piled up. I got a fur coat that fall. I got a mango. I got all kinds. By February, we had the vast sum of $250 in the bank, which was enormous. And then before that, when we'd go out riding on Sunday afternoon with Doris and George, the Rooneys, for amusement, we'd look at houses for rent. And then, of course, they'd finally just disappeared. Then we decided, well, we got to still have recreation, so we decided to look at houses for sale. And one Sunday when we were looking at houses for sale, we found this one, our home. The next thing you knew, we were negotiating, which we bought. It was a foreclosure. And then by the time the deal was closed, I guess it was too much for my mother to lose me completely because we lived next door when we lived northeast, and she thought she was going to lose me forever. She had a bad heart. I don't know to what extent it was an act or if it was really that she was actually sick. Anyway, the doctor had prepared her for death. He had us give her the last sacraments and everything. Well, then by that time, I didn't have the heart to move away, and then we were scared too because the payments were going to be so high, $22 a month plus the taxes, and we didn't know whether we could swing that. So we rented it then for 4 years. In the meantime, our sweet little bill came.
What was Lena paying here for rent?
$35.
So she was covering the taxes.
She was covering it.
Did you have any profit at all in it? Was that
No.
That was about it?
No. But at least we weren't out money.
You never mentioned about your Grandma LaFave either, or what you did when you went over there.
Well, while I was still working, it must have been in 1926, Grandma was living alone, very independent. She wouldn't go live with anybody. She didn't want to live with anybody. Of course, she had the means, a vast income of 3 rents, so she didn't have to live with anybody. And, of course, when I'd be working at the telephone company, when I'd walk to work, well, I'd always pass by her house, and I'd always visit with her, talk to her, visit with her. Well, one time when I was doing that, well, I decided to stay there nights so she wouldn't be alone. You see, by this time, she must have been 78. Anyway, I stayed with her nights, and every morning for breakfast, she'd have a big T-bone steak. And I don't think anybody in this world could fry it or fix it like Grandma could, and I'd eat every bit of it. I guess that's where I started to get fat.
Did you live with her then?
It was a year.
She spoke
No.
French too, didn't she? Or did she speak English?
We could get along in French. You see, I took up French in the French school, but I got my mother to write the sisters and cancel that because it was too hard, I said. I didn't want to learn. It was effort. But then when I got to high school, I took it. See, it was part of the academic course, so I took it, and then it was real easy. So I could talk to her.
Speak English at all?
She could speak very broken.
Well, how did you communicate then? You couldn't speak French?
Well, she wanted me to talk French as long as I knew some, but she could talk enough to get by.
Your grandfather spoke English, though.
Oh, yeah. He had to work, see.
Did he have a French accent? Didn't he?
He didn't have any. She did.
She did. Did Grandpa Hamel have any accent?
No.
You don't remember your Grandma Hamel, do you?
No, she died when I was a baby. We first came back to Minneapolis. We were living at 1315 6th Street Northeast. And I decided to, Sunday afternoon, there was no kids around, nobody to play with, and nothing doing at home, so I decided to go visit Grandma. She lived on 5th Street, and we were on 6th Street. That was a block over. Now, when we were there, I cut through somebody's yard, and I found a ring. And when I got over to Grandma's, I was going to do a great big thing. So I gave her the ring. The next thing I knew, she gave it to Leona.
Why did you do that?
I don't know. Of course, Leona was her pet. It's one of those things with kids. A person shouldn't show partiality. And as I said before, I was so far down in the family, nobody knew I was there. And maybe that's why when I started to have children, I shared them with everybody that wanted to pay attention to them, because, or show them any love, because I knew what it was not to be noticed. Nobody knew I was there.
Was that just the French way, or do you think that was a...
Well, there were so many big families that...
Because you used to say that Dad's family was always doted on the kids so much. Or was that
there
just
weren't
them?
many. That's why. They doted on now, with Lena, she doted on Dad. But she didn't pay attention to Clary and Lala. They were nothing. And then, of course, when we started to have children, it was just natural for her to come to our children. It wasn't because of me. But, of course, she got acquainted with me after, and maybe she appreciated the fact that I shared.
Why'd you talk about the unions? Now you got involved in the labor movement.
That one makes me very, very angry. Makes me so angry when I hear about all this, what's going on in the world today. You see, I can remember way, way back when I was a little girl. I was always the one that had ears all the time. And I can remember the family arguing over socialism. It was the IWWs in that day. Socialism, they hated it. They thought the ones that didn't want to work would live off of the ones that did want to work, which is true. In 1929, when I first started to go into the garment industry, I worked in there was a place where they made men's trousers and overalls. And you had to belong to the union. Of course, the boss recognized the union because he could sell his merchandise to the railroads, which were strongly unionized. And he needed that union label to sell his merchandise. And I'm sure he didn't give a darn about us. Well, anyway, I got acquainted with them because I had to belong to the union. And most of those garment shops did belong to the union. But along and about through the early Depression, the unions were idolizing Russia because that was the workman's paradise. And I think that one of the first speeches I heard by Walter Frank, he was in the Carpenters Union, that the union had sent him over to Russia, I guess to be converted or some darn thing. But anyway, he gave a speech at one of our union meetings. Now, this was all through the early 30s, 30, 31. After Roosevelt got in, it started about 1933, I'd say, 32. The union I belonged to was, I'm sure, was gangster controlled. We had a cutter that was a card-carrying communist, and I was working in a hotbed of them because the boss contributed to the party, and of course he was from Russia. Well, anyway, this cutter had us all convinced that the union was just terrible. He was trying to organize a union within a union, and we were falling for it. They set me up for being a secretary of our local, which I did. And then in the meantime, we were having little private meetings in each other's home to plan our strategy for the next union meeting, the local meeting. One time when I was up in the union office, one of the guys that was one of the cutters that was coming to all these little private meetings in the homes, he comes out of the main office with the union boss. Evidently he was a spy. We kept going, and not too much longer, but one of the meetings now that it was about 1933, I'd say, 32. It was shortly after Roosevelt got a hold of all of these NIRA and all of these programs, and then how the unions had to be recognized. a lot of these labor things that had to come about. One time the union boss got up and told before the local that the main, you see, we were just an arm of a local part of the union. The main office there had sent out word that they were going to assess every member of the union 2 days' pay for organizing. But then they were going to do the vast thing of leaving the money here in Minneapolis so we could organize here. Well, then the one that was the card-carrying communist had he had fixed it so he was president of the local. Here there was 2 communists. I was the secretary, a fellow traveler. Of course, he spoke up first. And of course, I had big mouth me, I got in there too. Well, that was the end of it. Union boss got it. He was madder than all get out. He gets up on his feet and he hollered and screamed and hollered and some more, and then he adjourned the meeting so everybody left. Well, anyway, we were called into St. Paul for a trial to see what to do with us, because that was very un-union-like to be questioning what they were going to do with this money. Well, anyway, we stood out. There was a bunch of us that went over there, and we had to stand on the street by the Globe building in St. Paul while they had this trial for us up in some office. We weren't allowed to even be in on the trial or see what we were charged with. It ended up where the one that was the president, or the card-carrying one, was blackballed completely. He could not get a job in any of the shops, and he was a cutter. That was his livelihood.
What was his name?
Kurtz, Morris Kurtz. The last I heard of him, he was on Skid Row.